Every morning, you probably eat bread without thinking about it. Toast it, buy it, forget about it. The whole transaction takes 90 seconds. But here is something almost nobody knows. The people who first figured out how to make bread didn't celebrate. The evidence suggests the choice carried risks they could not have measured. Because the decision to grow grain wasn't a discovery, it was a gamble. A permanent, irreversible gamble made on behalf of every generation that came after them. And for a long time, nobody knew if they had won or lost. This is the story of the most consequential gamble in human history. And the strange part is that the people who made it had absolutely no idea what they were wagering. Around 12,000 years ago, something began going wrong in the Middle East. The climate was shifting. Forests were shrinking. The large animals that humans had hunted for hundreds of thousands of years were becoming harder to find. Small bands of people who had spent their entire lives moving freely across enormous landscapes suddenly faced a word they didn't have language for yet: scarcity. They were hungry, not occasionally hungry, structurally, chronically hungry. And when humans get desperate enough, they start paying attention to things they previously ignored. On the hillsides of what is now Syria, Turkey, and northern Iraq, certain wild grasses grew in dense patches each spring. Their seeds were tiny and locked inside tough husks. Nutritionally, they were a poor substitute for the meat and varied plants hunter-gatherers had lived on. But in a bad year, with few alternatives, some group of people, we don't know exactly who or exactly where, began experimenting. Harvesting the seeds, grinding them between stones, mixing the powder with water and applying heat. It was slow, exhausting work, and the result was barely edible. But it could be stored, and that changed everything. Here's what made grain different from every other food source humans had ever used. Meat spoiled in days, berries lasted a week, but properly dried grain could survive for months, sometimes longer. For the first time in human history, food could be separated from time. You could work in summer and eat in winter. You could survive a catastrophic hunting season. You could build a buffer against disaster. And so early humans made a decision that felt practical at the time and that none of them understood was actually permanent. They stopped moving. Think about what that meant. For hundreds of thousands of years, mobility was the core human survival strategy. When food ran out in one place, you left. Farming erased that option. If you planted crops, invested months of labor in a field, built storage structures, you couldn't walk away when things got hard. You were anchored. And if the harvest failed, you had surrendered the one tool that had kept your ancestors alive. Early farmers were also giving up something else that nobody tracked at the time. Hunter-gatherers ate dozens of different foods across an entire year, multiple animal species, hundreds of plant varieties, roots, eggs, insects, fruit. When humans began depending heavily on grain, they collapsed that diversity into a handful of crops. Archaeologists who study early farming skeletons find something striking. The bones show more nutritional deficiency than the bones of hunter-gatherers from the same period. Early farmers were shorter. Their teeth were worse. They showed signs of diseases linked to poor diet. They were working significantly harder than their ancestors, and in many measurable ways, eating worse. So why didn't they stop? That question has a disturbing answer, and I'll come back to it. But first, something even stranger happened. In the mid-1990s, archaeologists began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Excavations are still ongoing today, and what they found there has never stopped unsettling historians. Göbekli Tepe is a massive ritual site. Enormous carved stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, arranged in precise circles. The construction required coordinated labor from large, organized groups of people. It required planning across seasons and possibly generations. It required, in other words, a level of social organization that, according to the established story of civilization, should not have existed yet. Because Göbekli Tepe dates to roughly 11,600 years ago, built at the very threshold of agriculture, possibly before fully established farming had taken hold in the region. And yet there it is, monumental, deliberate, organized. For most of the 20th century, the story historians told went like this. Farming created food surplus. Surplus freed some people from food production. Those freed people built cities, invented writing, organized religion, created law. Civilization emerged from abundance. That was the sequence: clean, logical, settled. Göbekli Tepe suggests the sequence may have been backwards. If large organized ritual gatherings existed at the very dawn of agriculture, then something else was pulling people together. And if large gatherings existed, they needed to be fed, which means the pressure to develop reliable grain agriculture may not have come from hunger alone. It may have come from ritual, from the need to feed hundreds of people who gathered regularly in one place for reasons that had nothing to do with survival. Which means civilization may not have been built on bread. Bread may have been built to sustain something that was already assembling itself for entirely different reasons. And here is where that abandoned question comes back. Why did early farmers keep farming even when their health was deteriorating, even when the work was harder, even when the diet was worse? Because they were no longer making individual decisions. They were embedded in something larger than themselves, a community, a ritual structure, a shared identity that required their participation and their grain. They stayed, they planted, they stored food against a future they could not control, and the risk that had started as desperation slowly became the architecture of everything that followed.
There is one more piece of the bread story that most people never hear. Because even after early farmers figured out how to grow grain and store it and grind it and cook it, the bread they produced was still barely worth eating. Dense, flat, hard, functional, not good. Then someone made a mistake. The exact moment is lost, but we know the rough shape of what happened. Sometime in ancient Egypt, or possibly earlier, wet grain paste was left sitting too long before cooking. Wild yeast floating in the air, the same microscopic fungi that exist in every kitchen in the world right now, landed in the paste and began feeding on it. The yeast consumed sugars and released carbon dioxide gas. Bubbles formed, trapped inside the sticky gluten of the wheat. The paste expanded. When it was finally cooked, something completely different emerged. Lighter, softer, with a depth of flavor that flatbread had never achieved.
Nobody understood what had happened. They just knew that under certain conditions, something invisible transformed the bread into something better. And so bakers spent centuries developing techniques to reliably reproduce conditions they couldn't explain, keeping small pieces of old dough alive and folding them into new batches, managing living fermentation cultures with complete precision and zero knowledge of what fermentation actually was. Researchers in the 1830s first observed yeast as living organisms, but it was Louis Pasteur's work in the 1860s and 1870s that demonstrated fermentation was driven by microbial life, not spontaneous chemistry. Which means humans had been maintaining and passing down living fermentation cultures for thousands of years before anyone understood what those cultures were. They kept doing it anyway, because it worked, because the bread it produced was better, because somewhere in the logic of human survival, the things that work get carried forward even when nobody fully understands why.
Tonight, somewhere in your city, there is a baker who woke up at 3 in the morning to check on a sourdough starter. That starter belongs to the same ancient practice of maintaining living fermentation cultures that bakers have passed down across thousands of years, through migrations, through famines, through the collapse of every civilization that hosted them. The first farmers made their choice when the safer option was to keep moving. They paid for it with worse health, harder labor, and the permanent surrender of mobility. They planted crops they wouldn't always live to harvest. They stored food against winters they couldn't predict. And somehow, that quiet series of risks accumulated into everything that came after. The gamble didn't end when bread became easy to make. It just changed shape. You're still making it. Every generation does. The only question is what you're planting and whether you'll be around to see what it becomes.